The stars had always carried with them a promise. For centuries, humanity had gazed upward with questions, prayers, and restless dreams, imagining what might dwell beyond the quiet glow of constellations. When the first signal came, it was not a whisper of static or a coded burst of mathematics, but a melody, haunting, almost sorrowful, resonating with something deeper than reason. The sound was unlike anything Earth had ever known, yet it spoke to every listener as if it had been composed for the human heart alone. That was how the world learned they were not alone. When the visitors arrived, they did not come with armadas or weapons. They came in shimmering vessels that bent light around their edges, almost invisible against the sky until they descended. They were tall, delicate beings, with pale luminous skin and eyes like mirrored pools that reflected more than light. They reflected memory, truth, the very essence of a soul. They called themselves the Ilari, and they came not as conquerors, but as seekers. The first contact was a marvel. Leaders of nations gathered, wary but captivated, while scientists scrambled to decipher the technology and philosophers argued over the meaning of it all. The Ilari explained that they had watched humanity for centuries, waiting for a moment when war would not define the species, when curiosity might outweigh destruction. They believed that moment had arrived. Their voices were gentle, their manner without arrogance. They offered knowledge, cures for diseases long thought incurable, methods to restore the wounded ecosystems, even energy that flowed without smoke, fire, or poison. In return, they asked for little, a place of refuge. Their world, they explained, was dying. A cataclysm they could not prevent had begun unraveling the very fabric of their atmosphere, and though their ships were many, they could not carry an entire civilization. They sought allies, not saviors, hoping that Earth might be their sanctuary, or at least a partner in finding one. Humanity had dreamed of reaching the stars, and now the stars had come to them in need. For a time, it seemed as though history had turned a glorious corner. Borders softened, if only slightly, under the weight of a common wonder. The United Nations hosted gatherings where Ilari sat beside human diplomats, their long fingers folded, their voices threading the halls with patience and clarity. Scientists and Ilari researchers worked side by side, exchanging knowledge so profound that within months medicine leapt decades forward. Forests blackened by industry were coaxed back into green by Ilari hands, and children who had been doomed to short lives walked again under new cures. Humanity, for a brief moment, touched something close to unity. But shadows grew quickly where light was brightest. The Ilari technology, though given freely, carried implications. Energy without cost meant economies disrupted. Medicines that healed with efficiency threatened empires built on profit. Politicians began to whisper behind closed doors, and generals sharpened their calculations. If the Ilari could do so much for Earth with so little effort, what else might they be capable of? And what if they were not as gentle as they seemed? It began subtly. A speech here, a headline there, raising questions about dependence on alien benefactors. What happens when they want something we cannot give? Commentators asked on nightly broadcasts. What if their dying world is a story, a trick to gain our trust? In secret, military programs dissected scraps of technology the Ilari shared, reverse engineering weapons that could wound even their advanced ships. Fear crept into the hearts of those who had once felt awe. The Ilari noticed. Their mirrored eyes revealed emotions hard to hide, and though they never spoke with accusation, sorrow settled into their voices. They continued to share knowledge, continued to offer their friendship, but something fragile had begun to fracture. And then came the turning point, the betrayal that would echo across both species forever. A meeting was held, one meant to finalize the creation of a joint settlement on Earth where Ilari refugees could live openly. It was to be a symbol of trust, a step into a future neither species could have reached alone. Thousands of Ilari gathered in a coastal city to celebrate, their luminous figures blending with human crowds in cautious joy. But as fireworks painted the night, the sky split open, not with ships, but with fire. Missiles, launched from hidden silos under orders never publicly acknowledged, streaked across the heavens and tore into the Ilari vessels anchored above. The air turned to ash and screams. The humans who had not known of the plan watched in horror. The soldiers who carried out the orders told themselves it was preemptive defense, that it was survival. But for the Ilari, it was betrayal made flesh. They had come with hands open, and those hands were burned. In the chaos, Ilari families fled into the night, hunted not by nature, but by those they had trusted. Some ships escaped Earth's atmosphere, limping into the void, but many were destroyed. The settlement that might have been a beacon became a graveyard of shattered glass and broken promises. The world reeled in silence afterward. Governments denied responsibility, each pointing to the shadows of others. Propaganda machines spun tales of Ilari deception, claiming the aliens had planned to conquer Earth and that the strike had been necessary. Some believed it. Many did not. But the damage was done. The Ilari who remained alive vanished, retreating into hidden enclaves or fleeing to the stars with scars too deep to heal. Years passed, and the gifts the Ilari had given became twisted relics. Technologies that might have healed were weaponized. Medicines that could have saved millions were hoarded by the powerful. The environment the Ilari had begun to restore once again sagged under human neglect. The promise of unity was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. Humanity, given its greatest chance to step into the cosmos as equals with another race, had instead chosen dominance, and in doing so, ensured isolation. Yet not all humans had betrayed them. Survivors of that night still remembered. A nurse who had been healed by an Ilari hand, a child whose lungs had been restored, a farmer whose fields had been revived. They carried their gratitude like secret fire. Underground networks whispered of finding the Ilari again, of apologizing, of rebuilding what had been lost. But apologies are fragile currency when trust has been burned to ash. In the silence of the stars, the Ilari carried with them not only their grief, but the knowledge of humanity's choice. Where once they had sung their haunting melodies across space, now they sent no signals. They withdrew, protecting themselves, shielding their dying world from eyes that would twist mercy into weakness. Humanity had failed them, and perhaps, in failing them, had failed itself. But stories, like civilizations, do not always end where they should. There remained a question, whispered in classrooms and carried in bedtime tales. If the Ilari ever returned, if humanity were ever given another chance, would they choose differently? Or had the betrayal of trust written itself too deeply into history to ever be undone? The stars gave no answer, only their silent glow, watching a species that once held the future in its grasp and let it slip away for fear and greed. The betrayal was not only of the Ilari. It was humanity betraying its own potential, its own promise, its own place among the stars. And in the cold vastness beyond Earth, the Ilari wept for what might have been. Among those who lived through the days of wonder was Daniel Kessler, a linguist from Berlin who had dedicated his life to unraveling forgotten tongues. When the Ilari melody reached Earth, it was Daniel who had first noticed its layered structure, the way it folded over itself like living poetry. He became one of the earliest human voices the Ilari trusted, invited to their councils not because of political influence, but because he listened. He never forgot the first time he looked into the mirrored eyes of Erin, one of their envoys. "You hear us differently," she said in a voice like wind over water. "I don't just hear," Daniel replied. "I feel. Your language isn't made for translation, it's made for resonance." That conversation marked the beginning of a friendship unlike any he had known. Erin taught him the cadences of her people, the way their voices carried not just meaning but emotion, how every phrase was woven with honesty. In return, Daniel taught her the strangeness of human speech, its contradictions, its slang, its capacity for both poetry and deceit. They laughed often at misunderstandings, and yet there was always an undercurrent of solemnity in Erin's presence. She carried the grief of her dying world within her like a hidden wound. Daniel saw firsthand the miracles the Ilari offered. He visited hospitals where children who had wasted away were lifted from beds, eyes bright with new life. He walked through forests where Ilari hands coaxed dying trees into sudden bloom. He listened as they explained that their technology was not domination, but harmony, a blending with the natural order, a way of shaping rather than consuming. For him, every day was proof that the Ilari had come as friends. Yet in the corners of every conference room, Daniel noticed the tightening jaws of politicians, the restless tapping of generals. He heard the whispers at night when journalists speculated whether the Ilari's dying world was a ruse. He watched his own government prepare reports not on cooperation, but on vulnerabilities. He tried to warn Aaron once. "They don't all trust you," he confessed as they walked along the spree one evening. The river reflected the starlight, and the Ilari ship hovered faintly above like a second moon. "We know," she answered, her mirrored gaze catching his own. "Trust is not given freely. We came prepared for fear. But we believed." Her voice trailed into silence. "Believed what?" Daniel pressed gently. "That humanity's capacity for wonder would be greater than its capacity for fear." Her words haunted him long after she departed for another council session. The night of betrayal carved itself into Daniel's memory as though seared by fire. He had traveled to the coastal city for the signing of the joint settlement agreement, his heart full of cautious hope. He remembered the smell of salt in the air, the mingling of human and Ilari voices and laughter, the way Erin stood beside him watching fireworks with something close to joy in her otherwise solemn expression. For a moment, the world felt as though it might truly change. Then the skies split open. At first, Daniel thought it was part of the celebration. Streaks of light arcing upward, brighter than fireworks. But Erin's body stiffened beside him, her mirrored eyes widening in a horror he did not yet understand. Then the explosions came, thunder tearing across the heavens as missiles found their targets. Ships that had hovered in peaceful silence erupted into flame and falling debris. Screams replaced laughter, and the air filled with fire and ash. Daniel remembered grabbing Erin's arm as the crowd scattered, pulling her toward cover as buildings shuddered under the concussive waves. Soldiers appeared, their rifles not pointed at the sky, but at the fleeing Ilari. He saw one of them, a young man, barely more than a boy, hesitate as an Ilari family stumbled past. The soldier's orders barked from a radio clipped to his vest. He fired anyway. It was chaos, a descent into madness. Daniel tried to shield Erin, dragging her through streets littered with glass and bodies. She moved as though in a trance, her face unreadable, but her eyes reflecting flames and betrayal. Somewhere behind them, one of the great ships fell into the ocean, its impact sending a tidal wave that consumed the shore. They escaped into the countryside, hiding in barns and abandoned houses while soldiers hunted the survivors. Daniel tended to Erin's wounds from falling debris, though she seemed more wounded in spirit than body. He tried to explain, tried to insist that not all humans had wanted this, that he had not known. But she only stared at him with those mirrored eyes, and he saw himself reflected there, not as he was, but as a member of the species that had done this. For weeks they wandered. Daniel heard rumors of massacres, of Ilari enclaves bombed into silence. Yet he also heard whispers of resistance, human civilians who smuggled survivors to safety, who turned their backs on their government's lies. He clung to that hope, praying it might prove to Erin that humanity was not wholly lost. One night, as they sheltered in the ruins of a church, Daniel asked her the question that had burned in him since the missiles fell. "Will your people ever forgive us?" Her answer was slow, heavy with sorrow. "Forgiveness is not ours to give. Trust once shattered is not mended by words. We gave you everything, our knowledge, our hope, our need. And you gave us fire." He wanted to argue, to beg, but the truth weighed too heavily. All he could say was, "I'm sorry." In time, Erin found a way to contact her remaining kin. A small ship, battered and hidden, came in the night to take her away. Daniel stood at the edge of a meadow watching as she boarded, his chest tight with a grief he could not name. She paused at the ramp, turned to him, and spoke the last words he would ever hear from her. "Remember this, Daniel Kessler. Betrayal is not only the breaking of promises. It is the breaking of possibility. You could have been more. You chose to be less. Then she was gone, carried into the sky like a fading star. Years passed. Daniel lived with the weight of her words, watching as his own species twisted the remnants of Ilari gifts into weapons of power. Cities grew more polluted again, forests withered once more, and the cures the Ilari had shared became property of the wealthy. The world forgot, or pretended to forget, the betrayal. History books spoke of defensive measures, of alien manipulation, rewriting the truth into a narrative of survival. But Daniel remembered. He told the story to anyone who would listen, though few believed him. He grew old with the sound of the Ilari melody still echoing in his memory, the haunting song that had once promised unity. Sometimes, late at night, he would climb the roof of his small house in the Bavarian countryside and stare at the stars, wondering if somewhere Erin still lived, if her people carried the memory of humanity not only as betrayers, but as individuals who had tried to stand with them. He wondered if the melody would ever return. It never did. And so humanity remained alone, not because the stars were empty, but because trust once shattered cannot be easily mended. The betrayal had burned a bridge that might never be rebuilt. Daniel died with regret heavy in his heart, knowing he had witnessed the single greatest chance humanity had ever been given, and watched as fear and greed destroyed it. He left behind journals, filled with his recollections of the Ilari, their songs, their kindness, and their sorrow. Few read them, fewer believed. But in time, as centuries passed, fragments of those journals survived. A new generation, weary of war and hunger, rediscovered his words. They asked themselves whether the Ilari still existed, whether there might yet be a path to redemption. They built ships of their own, crude compared to the luminous vessels Daniel once described, and they set their course for the stars. Whether they would be welcomed or turned away, none could know. But the question that haunted Daniel's final days became theirs as well. Would humanity, if given another chance, choose differently? The stars held their silence, watching, as they always had.